Okay, so thanks so much for coming. As I've said to several of the people who are connected with the program, I give talks all over the place, sometimes in Europe, especially lately, at colleges and universities around the United States. And of course, I get the great opportunity to lecture on a regular basis to the really incredibly talented undergraduates here at Vanderbilt. But there's really, honestly, not an audience that I enjoy talking with more than this group, the Osher/Ollie group. It's really interesting to get a chance to actually talk with people who have experienced some things, know some stuff, and might even give me a little bit of pushback about the crazy academic notions that I might have. My talk today is going to be a little bit less about the election itself and more about the strong emotions that seem to have characterized both the lead up to it and also, of course, the aftermath of it, which has been, really, of course, quite striking. I should add, I just got back from Berlin. I was there. I was on an airplane when the election was going on, when the votes were being counted, and I was just wondering, did anything happen while I was gone? This is, I just got back, and okay, so some things happened. So there's a metaphor that I want to, maybe stretch a little bit too far. But one of the things that I think is extraordinarily compelling is that we have this lack of communication between the two sides, what we might think of as the red cells and the blue cells in the body politic. And it's interesting, if you look at the medical side of things, when parts of the body, cells in the body fail to communicate, usually bad things happen. So there are cells in the body that need to tell the cells in the pancreas that they're supposed to produce insulin. And if they don't, you get diabetes. There are cells in the brain that need to communicate with other cells in the brain, and if they fail to, you end up with multiple sclerosis. What I'm suggesting here is that we are developing, because of our lack of communication across party lines, ideological lines, something of a political sclerosis. And it's with that in mind that I want to start the talk. So you might recognize this map. One of the great things about talking again to this audience is the 2000 election. You guys remember it. My students were like 4. So that's very dramatic, and this was of course the map that we saw. Then 4 years later, we saw a map that looked shockingly the same. There were 3 states that went in different directions than they did in 2000. In 2008, of course, there was one of the worst economic calamities in the history of the country, certainly in the last 100 years, and we saw some more states flip. But still, you can see the continuity in the electoral map that existed. And then in 2012, we went back a little bit closer to what we had in 2004 and 2000. And the point that I want to make here is that in those 4 elections, okay, so there were 4 elections, obviously, over that time period. They had Republican incumbents, they had Democratic incumbents. One time there was a war, one time there was a roaring economy, one time there was a terrible economy. There was an open seat race, that is, there was no incumbent. All of those different contexts, and yet 40 of the 50 states voted exactly the same way in all 4 of those elections. All right, so there's almost no change. Now, in 2016, we did see a little bit more in the way of change, but even in those cases, in several of them, Ohio is one of the states that flipped. So was Iowa, so was Florida. The only changes since dating back to the 1980s were Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all of which flipped, but just barely. All right, so we're not talking about really huge changes within those states. But I will say that I think those changes are actually significant and something that we can talk about a little bit later on. But we've had these incredibly close elections where the Electoral College map has been very, very close. 2000 and 2004 were the 2 closest Electoral College outcomes dating all the way back to 1916. So, I mean, these have been really, really close elections. 2008 wasn't very close, but 2012 was historically close. And 2016, again, we have one of those odd situations where the electoral vote winner, although he won relatively comfortably in the electoral vote, actually was the popular vote loser. So we have, you know, basically an electorate that is evenly divided. It seems like it's so close. But if you look below the national level, where it's basically 50-50 or 51-49 or 52-48, what you see is that the states are decreasingly competitive. So now I would like to just say, I was not around for the Kennedy-Nixon election. I don't mean to undermine my credibility with the audience. But I was -8 at that point. I was around for Carter against Ford. But what you see here is, you know, when I say the average state margin, what I'm saying is that if you add the margin of victory up in all 50 states and divide by 50, you know, the average was 8 or 9 percentage points in this bygone era during close elections. And of course, you know, 1980, 1984, 1988, 92, these were not close elections. Now we have nationally close elections, but the states are not competitive. The average margin of victory in 2012, when you add up all 50 states, you know, what the margin was divided by 50, 17 points. Most of the states are not battleground states any longer, whereas in 1976, when Carter narrowly beat Gerald Ford, 299 electoral votes were in play in states that were decided by 5 points or less. That's enough to win the entire electoral college. You need 270 to win. In 2012, only 75 electoral votes were decided from states that were, you know, actually competitive. Now, there were more in 2016 at this point, but still the trend is towards uncompetitiveness of states, not towards competitiveness of states. And if, you know, probably all of you live in Tennessee, I live in Tennessee, did any of you get the campaign here in terms of like the ground game, or how many presidential ads did you see? Probably almost none. My parents live in Pennsylvania. They wanted to throw a brick at the TV. However, they got the campaign, and that's how it is in this day and age. In 40 or so states, there might as well not be a presidential election going on as it relates to at least our voting. It's really only in 10 states. Or in the case of Hillary Clinton, who for some reason never set foot in Wisconsin, it should have been 11 states. Wisconsin, of course, being one of the states that she lost. All right, so there are political science-y and pundit-like nature of divisions that exist in the electorate. You know, there's a lot of talk about the white working class, but it's really whites overall versus the non-white population. About 60% of whites voted for the Republican presidential candidate. About 75% of non-whites did. So we see an unprecedented level of racial polarization in voting. We have an old versus young divide that also exists in places where, especially where whites are older. Those are the places where Trump did particularly well. Among younger voters, the groups that Clinton did best with were people under the age of 30. Now, of course, people under the age of 30 don't participate very much, so that's not very helpful. Last I checked, people over the age of 65 participate a lot, and that is helpful. So we have a young versus old thing. We have a gender gap that everybody expected to be much wider in 2016 than it was, for all the obvious reasons. This is polite company. I won't go into some of the things that were said, during the course of the election. But we also had a woman at the top of the ticket for the first time. So that should have, created an enormous gender gap. But the funny thing is, there's a substantial gender gap, but not actually as large as the gender gap that existed when Bill Clinton beat Bob Dole. In fact, not even close. The gender gap was about 13 points versus about 20 points when Clinton defeated Dole in 1996. And in fact, white women were more likely to vote for Trump than they were for Clinton. But where the real action is going on and this is where I want to bring you guys into the conversation, is we often talk about states, red states and blue states. Tennessee is a red state. The South is full of red states. The Northeast, of course, and the West Coast are blue states. But as somebody from Pennsylvania, I can tell you that it's really not about the states. It's really about population density. In places where there are cities, big cities especially, cities like Philadelphia, cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, those are the Democratic strongholds. And in places where population density is relatively low, those are Republican strongholds. So if you think about the South, why is the South so Republican? Why is it so red? Because there are few population centers relative to the sort of more suburban and rural populations. Tennessee has, 2 medium-sized cities and a lot of the rest of the state. That's one of the key reasons why it's so red. Atlanta is one big city in a sea of red counties. There are just more people in those areas. But you think about Pennsylvania, why is that now an increasingly purple state? Well, as James Carville, the old political consultant who ran Bill Clinton's campaign, said, Pennsylvania is Alabama in between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, okay? And I'm from the Alabama part, in Harrisburg, and interestingly, I married a woman from Alabama, okay? So with all of these things in mind, there's something to be said for this. Election outcomes are really about population density as much as anything. But let me ask you guys to think about something as we go forward here. What might make somebody decide to live in the suburbs or a rural area? Or what might make them decide to live in the city? I mean, do you think that that's just like a coin flip kind of decision for people? Or do you think it's something that they're motivated to do because of something, maybe deep down inside of them? So with that thought in mind, I also want to point out some crazy stuff that comes from all sorts of micro-targeting data and just other different areas. So there's an old website called Hunch.com, and they did a survey of people's ideology by their food preferences. Now again, this isn't representative of the United States, but it kind of rings true. The sort of the quintessential meal for somebody on the political right involves meatloaf and mashed potatoes. For those on the political left, actually, it was, I believe, chicken tikka masala, along with a nice little biryani on the side. The micro-targeting data is crazy too. It shows that Republican beers are lighter in color and fewer in calorie. The beers that are more likely to be consumed by Republicans. Whereas if you've run into a microbrew drinker, somebody who's toting around something from some obscure brewery, it's almost certainly a Democrat. All right, there's something going on there. I mean, these are true facts. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that Republicans are not choosing to drink light beer because they're Republicans. All right, this is not causal, but it is related. All right, and if it's a low-calorie beer, Republicans will even drink a foreign beer. But if it's a regular calorie beer, Democrats drink those. Okay, so Macs versus PCs, of course, the PC party is the Republicans, the Mac party is the Democrats. Let's say somebody goes out into the parking lot and climbs into a Toyota Prius after leaving here. Would you make any decisions about what that person's politics might be like? It's like the calling card of all liberals is the Toyota Prius. But let's say instead the person gets into a car that I wasn't familiar with until I moved to Tennessee, and that is the GMC Yukon XL. Not just the regular GMC Yukon, the XL version. You're probably guessing that person might be a Republican. It's true. There's also differences between cat and dog preferences. No lie. John Haidt's work shows that Democrats are much more likely to own cats than dogs. It's not that people don't love dogs across party lines, but even in the dog constituency, Republicans like a different kind of dog and a different relationship with their dog. So Height's work shows that Democrats have this desire to have like a relationship with their dog. It's a very horizontal understanding of the dog. The dog is sort of part of the family. In conservative families, the dog is the dog. And so just to give you maybe an insight on me, that's my dog. So let's unpack this a little bit. What is it about my dog? What does it tell me about my politics? What are some things that jump out to you? A little audience participation. What's that? It's what? It's foreign-ish. Yeah, it's a mini labradoodle, which has its roots in Australia. Yes.
Super smart.
He's very smart. I mean, he's like the Einstein of dogs. But you know, I don't know if that's as important. What else do we see about him? He is warm. He's fuzzy. He's little. You know, he's on the couch. He's on the furniture. Yes, sir. What's that? I'm not a hunter. You were right about that. I don't know what caused that to jump out about me. But you know, I love my dog. And my friend Randy, who's from Oklahoma, loves his dog too. Randy's conservative. His dogs look like wolves, as far as I'm concerned, and they live outside. My dog sleeps on my bed. So anyway, there's that. It turns out actually that we watch different shows. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time at this, but there are shows that skew Republican according to the Nielsen data, and there are shows that skew Democratic according to the Nielsen data. This is just the most recent one, 2014, but there's actually kind of a pattern that emerges. First of all, what conservatives seem to be drawn to is reality shows, competition. These are, you know, the types of things that are interesting to them. So shows like Amazing Race, Survivor, The Bachelor, it turns out, Dancing with the Stars, things along those lines. Democratic shows tend to skew towards quirky characters who are just not quite right. So, although it's not on this, my favorite show, as I am a caricature, obviously, of the liberal college professor with the fuzzy dog and who sits on the furniture, is Mad Men. Mad Men is a show. All right. So I have some Democrats in the room because Mad Men is the show that skews most Democratic. But think about Mad Men. Who wants to spend their day with Don Draper, like one of the worst guys? Well, I mean, but one of the worst people in the world, as good-looking as he might be. You know, here's a serial philanderer, you know, having affairs in front of his children, you know, drunk all the time. All of this kind of stuff. He's a quirky guy. He's very strange. Then there's Dexter. I don't know if you ever knew the Showtime show Dexter. Dexter is a serial killer of serial killers. Complicated. Then you have Tina Fey's 30 Rock. You know, these types of shows are the ones that Republicans don't seem to be that interested in, but Democrats love. All right? So we do have these. Now, again, not all of these things. Oh, and I should add, Republicans seem to go for the, or Democrats go for the cartoons. So you have the Bob's Burgers, Family Guy, The Simpsons. Again, you know, sort of not. So what I'm showing here, what I'm getting at here is there's something about us deep inside that's different. That's key, and I'm going to explore that a little bit more. But what I want to keep this focused on is this. We are, as red cells and blue cells, decreasingly having the same life experiences across party lines. All right? It's not just that we don't live together, but that's true. You know, there's been this residential segregation that's been taking place by party. But we also don't watch the same shows. We don't eat the same food. We don't drink the same beer. We are just moving into these sort of hermetically sealed silos that doesn't include the other side. We watch, you know, of course, different news and things like that. So this is something that I've pointed out on a number of occasions. These are the 5 women who are on the Fox top-rated shows that include a woman. What do they have in common? Okay, so they're all blonde. Now think about MSNBC or CNN, the women look different. Now, of course, they're all beautiful, but the question is, does this happen by mistake, or is there a set of market researchers that do tests on who Fox viewers want to see? And of course, it's market research that this is and of course, it's a disproportionately male audience, and this appears to be the beauty ideal of those on the political right. I would suggest that on the political left, it's going to be different. There's another interesting thing about this too. They're all blonde. Anything else about them that stands out? They all look very similar. None of them wear glasses, which is interesting. Oh yeah. Though anybody who goes on TV should get made up. Having been on TV not made up, don't do that. So there's that. So we watch different sports, it turns out. The most Republican-leaning sport, and Republicans just watch sports more. There's no doubt. But that fits in with the competition part, right? You watch reality shows, there's competition there. But college football, and especially the PGA Tour, are places where there's a really strong red Republican skew. Democrats watch fewer sports. Almost all of them are fringe, with the exception of the NBA. And some of them are just weird, like pro wrestling, extreme action sports, the very foreign soccer. These are things where Democrats have a skew, but on most things it's the other. And again, not to belabor the point about blondness, but this was the Ryder Cup team. I'm actually a big golf fan. This is the American Ryder Cup team after they won the Ryder Cup. Now, the poor guy in the middle doesn't have anybody to kiss, but other than him, what do all of the women have in common? They're all blonde-haired. It's really, quite remarkable. So the most Republican-skewed sport also seems to attract the same thing. All right, so where am I going with this? Well, I'm going to actually introduce some social science. I know that can be jarring. And this is actually weird social science. But I think it's something that reveals something about American politics that we can't quite put our hands on. We can't quite put our fingers on with a survey. Usually when we study the American electorate, we use a survey. We ask people questions, but there are certain things that people maybe don't want to reveal about themselves or can't reveal about themselves, or what is true about them is just different in different situations, okay? So why would we end up with these different beauty ideals, these different preferences about shows, these different, what is the dividing line about those things? And, there are all these really different approaches that people have been taking as relates to biological studies and physiological studies, and they're sort of at the fringe of social science. They're not, at the center of it at all. But given the circumstances, I think it might be worth thinking about a little bit. So when I talk about eye tests, what do I mean by that? So I'll point up the part about dangerous or disturbing images. So there's a group of researchers at the University of Nebraska, Kevin Smith is the key person, who did eye tracking tests on liberals and conservatives. So people filled out a questionnaire about whether they were scored on the liberal side or the conservative side of the divide. But that was just done at another time. And then they came into the lab and they put eye tracking devices on. They're actually eye tracking devices that you can use to see where a person is looking, where their eyes are dwelling. And they gave them a palette of objects, and some of them were disturbing or scary or something along those lines. And then some of them were like beach balls, just sort of like happy things. Well, it turned out that everybody dwells on the dangerous things more than the less dangerous things. Well, why would we dwell on the dangerous things? Because we're animals, we're humans. This is what keeps us alive. But the thing that's interesting is that conservatives dwelled on those negative objects, the scary objects, far longer than liberals did. So liberals, are wary, but conservatives are way more wary. Liberals were more likely to look at the beach balls. Conservatives didn't bother with the beach balls. Physiological differences, startle reflex. So how do we study that? I would love to be the lab assistant on this, okay? Actually, I wouldn't. It just sounds so terrible. But imagine yourself, you go into the lab, and they hook you up with these things called blink amplitude meters. And it's going to count the number of times you blink, all right? And then they put headphones on you. And you're just sitting there, And then all of a sudden there is a loud sound of white noise that goes through the headphones. And then everybody startles. But some people startle more than others. And you measure that by how fast you blink after you've been startled. So this could be like the scary movie test. Who jumps more? Everybody jumps. But it turns out that conservatives jump much more than liberals do. Again, startle reflex is supposed to be about wariness, being concerned about things. Gag reflex is the same. Conservatives, it turns out, have a more profound gag reflex, which is about maintaining purity and things along those lines. Now, that's interesting. We can see maybe how those things add up to politics on one level or another. The key thing, though, is we develop personalities probably in conjunction with these physiological and biological things that we have in us. Okay, and it turns out there's what they call the Big Five personality characteristics. They call it the Big Five. 2 of them are highly related to partisanship. One of them is openness to experience. Liberals tend to be, and Democrats tend to be, way more open to experience. So you can see why places like cities would be attractive. Conservatives and Republicans score much lower in openness to experience. Conservatives and Republicans score much higher in conscientiousness. That is a desire to maintain traditions, to value time-honored ways of doing things, to be concerned about other people's time and space and things along those lines. Democrats much less so. So we can see why maybe Republicans and conservatives might end up in the sort of tradition-based, regular way of doing things, not rocking the boat very much, suburbs. Now again, one thing I want to make clear is there's nothing right or wrong or good or bad about any of these personality characteristics. We all probably recognize more of ourselves in one of these things. We value more of one of these sides more than the other. But it's not to say that the world wouldn't go around if you were more conscientious. But anyway, this conscientiousness is something that's a little harder to illustrate. But let me ask you this, and this usually works especially with students. If you are having a meeting at, say, 9:15, and somebody shows up at 9:30, is that person more likely a Democrat or a Republican? It's a Democrat, of course. Lower conscientiousness. If the person's there at 9:10, it's a Republican. Okay. Again, these things are all on average, but anyway, you can see how these things might build up to something. So, what my friend and co-author and I have, what we identify this as, this all fits together into what we call a worldview, and worldviews can be at 2 ends of a continuum and anywhere in between. But the 2 endpoints of the continuum, the more conservative side, we call a fixed worldview. A fixed worldview. So there's a desire for order, tendency to rely on hierarchies which have worked in the past to protect this order. So you can see where religious organizations in particular would have a lot of wisdom to it. Where advice comes from on high to a demonstrably below set of people. Embrace of the conventional. Why upset the apple cart? Why change things if we don't need to change them? If it's not broken, don't fix it. So the sort of conventional tendency, though, to be wary, to see the world in us versus them terms. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this wariness is how it manifests and how people see others. So there's a classic question that's asked on the political surveys. Do you think most people can be trusted, or do you think that you can't be too careful? People have to put themselves in one of those categories. People who are more conservative and Republican are much more likely to say, can't be too careful. Liberals and Democrats are more likely to say, yeah, I trust most people. And why is that? This sort of maybe us versus them, way of thinking about things. More wary of change, wary of threats. So you think about immigration from Mexico or wherever it might be. That maybe that's great, maybe, but maybe it's a threat. Refugees from Syria. Well, I have a big heart. I'd really like to bring people in, but they might want to blow me up. Okay? There would be more of that wariness, that concern. It's not to say that it's incredibly misplaced concern. Politically, we can disagree about that, but that's where it emanates from. It emanates from deep down inside of us. You know, what our startle reflex is, what our gag reflex is, what our personalities are, and things like that. On the other side, what we call the other side of this divide is a fluid worldview. Fluid worldview. People are open to new experiences. You know, we hear the term xenophobic a lot to describe people who are more, well, Trump supporters. But xenophiliac would be people who love the different. You know, it's not even just that they're okay with difference. They love it. The idea of being surrounded by difference is actually a plus, you know, not a minus. People with a fluid worldview would fall into this category. But you could see how somebody with a fixed worldview, who's a little bit concerned about this difference, might be very concerned about what someone with a fluid worldview thinks about things. They fundamentally don't get each other along these lines. And social change, you know, personal preferences, say, about sexuality or something like that, that would be something that people with a fluid worldview would be fine with. But people with a fixed world would be like, well, it's never been that way before. You know, why should we change that now? Okay? But think about this. If you guys are of one side or disproportionately of one side or the other, how difficult it is for you to understand how the other side possibly could believe what they do. Now, if we were just talking about the budget, well, you know, how much should we spend on highways? We can compromise on that. But the types of things that characterize our politics these days are not about compromises along those lines. They're about, you know, these sort of status issues. They're about, you know, the proper role of the state in ensuring and how best to ensure our safety and our security and things along those lines. So, as social scientists, we have to measure these things somehow using surveys so that we can make inferences about what's going on in the mass public. And this might be the most off-the-wall sounding thing in the world. Well, maybe the most off-the-wall sounding thing in the world is that Donald Trump is going to be president on January 21st next year. That feels pretty off the wall. But close to that, that was my laugh line. I mean, come on, guys. Come on, guys. I mean, seriously, a year and a half ago, could you possibly have imagined that? No. I mean, you know, whether you embrace it or not, could you have possibly imagined it? I don't think he could either, and it seems like that's actually good evidence of that. Mm-hmm. And now when he won, he sits there and goes, what do you mean I got to hire everybody to put above my shoes in the White House? I think there's something to be said for that. You know, the evidence seems to suggest he didn't think he was going to win either. He was thinking, you know, I'll stick around for a couple of primaries and I'll be done. But other than that, another off-the-wall possibility is that I can basically predict your politics by asking you about your choice in the desirable qualities of children. That's what I can do. So the way we think about worldview, the way we measure worldview is the answers to these questions. You know, many of you, probably most of you, are either parents or grandparents. I'm a parent. I have 2 kids. I want my kids to have all 8 of these things. I especially want them to be obedient in certain cases. And I want them to respect their elders all the time, all right? But if I had to choose between independence or respect for elders, I value both of those things. But which one do I value more? Or obedience and self-reliance. Which one do I value more? Curiosity, good manners. I make them choose, okay? And it turns out that more people choose the more fixed responses. Fewer people choose the more fluid responses. But what's important is that it maps onto politics incredibly well. So what I've done here is I've mapped out President Obama's approval rating by people's responses to those 4 questions in 2 different surveys, one done in 2010 and one done in 2012. So these are people who are completely fluid, and you can see that they're about 75% likely to approve of the job the president is doing. I didn't ask them their partisanship. I didn't ask them their ideology. I asked them their parenting preferences, and 3/4. Now, if we come over to the fixed end, less than 1/4 approve of the president. People who say obedience, obedience, respect for elders, being good-mannered, and things along those lines. It's incredible. This is, if you don't like approval, we can talk about voting. This is the percentage of Republican votes in 2012 for either the Senate, the President, or the House. Only about 20% of people who are fluid in their worldview voted for Republican candidates, but about 70% of those with a fixed worldview voted for Republican candidates in 2012. My suspicion is that relationship, although the data aren't available yet, is even stronger for this particular election, because Donald Trump is somebody who appealed to those with a more fixed worldview. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. So the question, it's a very good one. So what about Obama? The way that I would think about it is Obama is a challenge, was a challenge to everything that was fixed. You know, whether it was his race, whether it was his politics, which are quite liberal, whether it was his embrace of difference. He is different, and you know, he embraces groups who are also different. In that sense, and this divide hasn't been around forever. Really, the 2004 and especially the 2008 election is where this all developed. So the fluid worldview people loved Obama. He's manna to them. He's Mr. Mr. Nuance and Shades of Gray, whereas the Republicans tend to be more black and white, more straightforward in their thinking. So Obama, the fluid would love him, but the fixed would be concerned, you know, because he's different, you know, in so many different ways. Trump, of course, is offering kind of a return to that pre-Obama past, or you know, maybe even the pre-Franklin Roosevelt past, and that is, you know, very attractive to people who have a more fixed worldview. You know, the country's getting more diverse. That might be very threatening to them. Trump is offering us, you know, something different. He's going to make America great again. You know, sort of a backwards-looking, you know, kind of thing. But to someone who believes in traditions and how things have been in the past, this would be really attractive, right? Hillary Clinton, the fluids like her. She's a woman. Interestingly, though, the fluids, they didn't really like her as much as they liked Bernie Sanders. They really liked Bernie, you know, in that regard. And if you look around college towns where fluid worldview people tend to congregate, Bernie, he killed in places like Madison and Durham and places like that. I'm going to skip that. How much time do we have here? I want to give you guys plenty of time to talk. But, you know, this is, again, what Trump was sort of offering. But where I really want to go with this is where we are, where we find ourselves today, because it's really troubling. You know, this sort of political sclerosis that I was talking about. And I think that this graph is, and I'll take a couple minutes to explain it, is what characterizes what's wrong in American politics these days. So what I have here is what are called feeling thermometer scores, the average feeling thermometer scores that different groups provided about different institutions, okay? Now, what's a feeling thermometer? No joke, a survey interviewer comes into your house and shows you a thermometer. It is got a low point of 0, a high point of 100, and says, I want you to, you know, place your feelings about this group or this person on the feeling thermometer. You can choose anything between 0 and 100. They just tell you, you know, 50 is neutral. If you love them, 100. If you hate them, 0, and so forth. And then everybody, you know, provides their response. And what I've just simply done is taken the average. And this goes back to the Jimmy Carter years and the average during the Reagan years, the Bush years, and so forth, the Obama years. And what I've done here is divided Republicans from Democrats. So the blue lines are the opinions of the average score that Democrats gave. And the red lines are, of course, Republicans. The solid lines are how they feel about their own party, and the broken lines are how they feel about the other party. So what we feel about our own party is basically the same over time. You know, we love our own party. These are our guys, or our women. 76 degrees for Democrats in the Carter years, 76 degrees for Democrats in the Obama years. But here's the change. It's how we feel about the other side. You know, we used to feel okay about our opponents. You know, Democrats gave an average score of 47 to the Republican Party, and Republicans gave a score of 45 to the Democratic Party. I mean, you know, 45, I mean, you know, you could play golf in 45. I mean, it's not a problem. And you can see that it was like that until the Clinton presidency, and then it just drops off the map. So when I say that the average score that Democrats give Republicans give the Democratic Party is 28 degrees and 26 degrees for Democrats' rating of the Republican Party, that's really low. But what does that mean? Just to put it into some perspective, Republicans provide a higher feeling thermometer score for atheists than they do the Democratic Party. No joke. It's not even close, actually. And Democrats give, you know, the label in the data are Christian fundamentalists. Democrats give Christian fundamentalists a much higher score than they give the Republican Party. Okay, both sides give illegal immigrants, not immigrants, illegal immigrants a much higher score than the other party. Okay. So what we're talking about is among the most frigid scores ever. My co-author Tom Rudolph and I, we had to go back to the 1970s to find a place where these scores were that low. You know, right during the AIDS crisis, homosexuals got a feeling thermometer score in the 20s. It's been a long time since we've had groups this unpopular. So what I want you to realize is that this politics that's deep down inside of us causes us not just to dislike the other side, but to hate the other side. So how might this hatred manifest itself? Well, obviously we can see the manifestations in politics, but it's happening all around us in all sorts of different things. So this is an old survey that was done back in 1960 by Ullman and Verba, two of the most important political scientists ever. And what they found, you know, they asked people how discomfited they would be if their child married a supporter of the other party. Nobody was concerned about it. 5%, 4%. Probably more people believe in Area 51, you know, in Roswell, than thought that was a problem. 2010, Shanto Angar and a couple of his co-authors did a similar study using basically the same questions and found 50% of Republicans and half of Republicans, a third of Democrats would be concerned, would be discomfited if their child married somebody from the other party. That's pretty deep dislike. There are these tests that are called implicit attitude tests in the social sciences. You may have even taken one to test your implicit bias about race. And basically what they do is they show images of, they flash words that are either positively valenced or negatively valenced, and then they ask you to categorize them into good and bad. You know, so, and how quickly you can do it can reveal you know, what your feelings are deep down inside about a group. And what these implicit attitude tests show is that our automatic, completely reflexive bias towards people of the other party are stronger than they are than people of other races. So in other words, your implicit bias against a Democrat, if you're a Republican, is significantly stronger than your implicit bias towards an African American if you're white. All right? And it's not like racial bias has gone away. It's that we don't have any control over these feelings. These are just things that are deep down inside of us. As it relates to explicit bias, the same people who did the implicit associations test on partisanship showed that we are much more likely to discriminate against the other party, people of the other party, in various different things. So the experiment that I have in mind here, explicit bias in the awarding of a scholarship, gave people a scholarship candidate, and they had to decide who was going to get it, so the pair of two people. One of the people who was the potential recipient of the scholarship was identified as either being a college Republican president or a college Democrat president. And everything else was basically the same. And another thing that they varied was the degree to which what the person's grades were. All right? And what we found was that over 70% of Republicans and Democrats would give the scholarship to a person of their party, even if they were less qualified by grade point average. Everything else is the same. But, and again, 80% would do it if they were equal, and 90% would if their side had a higher grade point average. But 70% still would give the scholarship to the person who is of their party, even if their grade point average was 0.5 less on a 4-point scale than the person who is from the other party. And obviously, it's in this context that we see this politics that is so concerning and so disruptive and so awful. You guys have been around. You know that we haven't seen political protests like this since the 1968 election, and the feelings are incredibly, incredibly strong. This I thought might be particularly resonant. Here, this woman got punched out at a Trump rally by one of the people. She was a protester against Trump. She was injured. She probably would have been less badly injured, except for she fell on her oxygen tank. Anyway, this is the passion that we're talking about as it relates to politics. That's passion. That's the other side of passion that we have there. And, again, all of this is pretty depressing stuff. And so what I want to kind of conclude with is a couple of things that I usually do with students. I'm not going to actually, play the videos for you guys. But, I don't want you guys to think that, the old professor, he, tells his students how bad things are and doesn't provide any, hope, for the future. Because what I really do think is the only way that things change is if this new generation, this younger generation of people starts to do things differently than my generation did. And I would say more like your generation did than the generations between you and them, and especially the types of things that my father and mother, who are 87 and 88, what their generation did. They truly were a greatest generation. And what I try to tell the students, this is Obama's famous speech in 2008 at the end of his campaign in Manassas, Virginia, and he tells the story of a campaign volunteer in Greenwood, Iowa. And it ends with the famous "fired up, ready to go" chant. But the thing that's important about this volunteer is that because of who she was and her force of personality, she changed a whole room. She lifted everybody's spirits, even though people were down. And Obama's lines before "fired up and ready to go," because that was her chant, what he points out is, a person can change a room, and a room can change a city, and a city can change a state, and a state can change a country, and a country can change the world. But it starts with one person. And that's something that I think it's important for students to keep in mind. Second video I often show them is an old video from a ESPN feature called First Pitch. I don't know if anybody ever saw it, but what it does is it captures George Bush throwing out the first pitch in Game 3 of the World Series in 2001 after the September 11th terrorist attacks. It is as good of a half hour of television that you can watch. You can Google First Pitch on ESPN, but I don't show the whole thing. But what I do show is, how this, just star-crossed president dealt the worst possible hand that you could imagine being dealt. Terrorist attacks within 9 months of the beginning of his presidency, marches out to the mound at Yankee Stadium, the bluest of the blue places that you can imagine, throws a dart, throws a strike, and the crowd goes crazy. In other words, the country came together. Even the bluest of the blue places were completely behind, the young president, dealt this terrible hand. And what I try to tell them at the end, there's our guys. What I try to tell them at the end is a story that is one of the most, sort of important ones to me. And you guys have probably had, things like this happen to you in the past where, sometimes you just have to go somewhere and you don't really want to go. And then something remarkable happens when you have to be there. And that happened to me in 2004 when my wife, Suzanne, and I and our 2 little kids, we had just moved to Nashville. And, it was maybe 2 or 3 months into our time there. And if you guys have ever, moved, those first 6 months are just terrible. Especially if you have a 3-month-old and a 3.5-year-old. It was really a rough time. But, I got this invitation from the chancellor, Gordon Gee at the time, and he invited me to a dinner at his house for a speaker who we had in town named Ron Suskind. Suskind is a longtime journalist and author and, sort of an important political figure. And I was like, I guess I got to go to that. And, he's giving a talk in advance, so I better go to the talk. Well, it was about polarization. This was in 2004, and this was just sort of taking hold. And somebody raised his hand or her hand and asked, well, how are we ever going to overcome this? And Suskind didn't answer how, but what he tried to capture was a moment. What he tried to capture was a moment. And he took us back to 1969, the day of the moon landing, which of course you guys remember better than I do. I was one. Just for you guys keeping track of the math, I was only one. And I've been told that I watched it by my parents. But Suskind was a teenager, and he was with his brother and his mom and his dad down in the bottom level of a split-level house somewhere in Delaware. And you guys know split-level houses, they're totally dark, below ground, and they're watching the LEM, come in, and all of a sudden the power goes out. Power goes out. And there's, panic in the room, and his dad, sort of a World War II era dad, in his big commanding voice says, everybody come to me. And he puts his arms out, and it's completely dark, the kids, and the wife, they get him by the arm, and they walk up the steps. The dad leads them up the steps. And they go, of course, into a carport, because you always have a carport attached to a split-level house. And they assess the situation. And in assessing the situation, they realize there are no lights anywhere. What are we going to do? We're going to miss the moon landing. And Suskind said, they look to their dad, because, their dad's the World War II guy with all the answers. And the dad says, everybody into the car. We're going to drive until we see light. We're going to drive until we see light. So everybody piles in the car. Dad puts it into reverse, is driving, reasonably fast out of the driveway. People, especially his wife, are a little bit panicked. The kids love it because the kids are, of course, in the back seat of the car wearing their surely flammable jammies in the back seat of a bench seat car that's surely, the seats are vinyl, so they're going to get quite a ride during the course of this. So they are sliding back and forth, and but the mom is saying, you got to be careful, you got to be careful. And he said, I'm driving to the light. I've got to drive to the light. I got to drive to the light. They crest a hill. They get a little bit of air. The kids love it. Woo! The mom's like, come on, please. We got to be careful. We got to. And he said, I'm driving to the light. I got to drive to the light. And they finally crest another hill, and they turn around the corner, and they see lights. And the dad just pulls it into basically the front yard of the house. Suskind said that he put all 4 wheels on the front lawn. Everybody jumps out of the car, runs to the door. So first of all, let me stop for a minute. Can you imagine in this day and age anything like that happening? And of course the answer is no. But they run to the door, knock on the door. The person invites them in. Can you imagine that happening? I can't imagine it happening either. And in fact, it turns out there are a bunch of people who have done exactly the same thing. They go down to the basement of another split-level house somewhere else in Delaware. And what do they experience? What they experience is this great moment of national joy with a bunch of people, some of whom were almost certainly Republicans, some of whom were almost certainly Democrats. But none of those things mattered quite as much, back in those days. And it's that moment that I think we really need to recapture, where the red cells and the blue cells actually talk to each other. And so my admonition to the kids is drive us to the light. So with that in mind, I'm ready to answer questions. And the person in the purple here, she's ready.
I believe that the Great Divide is because of the media. Because media feeds us all of this crap. So that you choose one side or the other. And then just like the polls were wrong in this election, I always tend to question statistical information and the audiences that information is derived from. And it troubles me that grant funds that the taxpayers pay for these studies study things like someone's eyes looking at objects on a table to tell if they're Democratic or Republican.
Yeah.
You know, it just seems like
What are you saying about my research?
I'm just saying that, you know, we all have to listen to ourselves. And you're selling a book, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but
I'm not selling it yet. It's not done.
this information is fed to our students that are 18 and in college, and their brains are, you know, I just find that the Great Divide is the media. And back in the 60s when we could go to each other's houses and watch TV, the media wasn't feeding us all this hate and fear and everybody's getting shot and you let your kids out and they're going to be sexually molested.
Let me ask you a question. So were crime rates higher today or lower today than in the 1960s? Yeah. All of these markers of a healthy society. I know. And why is that? Of course, because these types of things sell. Because people are wary. Because they're worried. And it sells disproportionately to people who are wired a certain way. So I think it's kind of interesting, you know, again, you know, with all due respect, I think that we've identified what might be at the core of, you know, people's physiologies that would cause them to react to the same information in different ways is really important. As it relates to the media, most people don't watch Fox. Most people don't watch CNN or MSNBC. Most people sit around, you know. So just to put that into some perspective, the biggest audience that Fox gets is for Bill O'Reilly's show. And 5 times the number of people watch NCIS. Fewer than 10 million people watch these shows in an electorate of 128 million. So are the media a problem? Yeah, I think that they really are. I mean, and we've developed this sense of 2 different realities. We don't have the same shared experience. Now, where I think that you're really right is in the 1960s, the 1970s, and even into the 1980s, we shared the same reality because we all watched the same news programs. Now we're less likely to do that. So let me give you a sense of what manifestation that might have. So the most recent national election study asked a question like they always do. Do you think the economy's gotten better, worse, or stayed the same over the course of the last year? And of course, Democrats always want to see it better when their side's in, and Republicans want to see it worse. So when George Bush was running for president in 1988, Republicans, when asked that question, were about 20 points rosier, and Democrats 20 points less rosy. All right? Any conjecture about what that difference was in 2016? 50 percentage points. Republicans, for reasons that are completely beyond me, think that the economy has gotten worse over the past year. Now, maybe their own economic circumstances are not as good, you know, or the people around them. But the question was about the national economy. If Democrats were out, you know, so when this question is asked again in 2018, we'll see the reverse happen. Democrats will all of a sudden see a collapsing economy, and Republicans will see it as better. But the reason that we can, partly is hate, but partly is because we occupy these different realities. We hermetically seal ourselves in information environments. Think about your Facebook feeds. How many people in your social networks differ from you politically, you know, and are going to tell you, well, you know, actually the economy, it's gotten a lot better. You know, the Dow's doubled since Obama's been president. Oh, but that doesn't happen. Question in the back. Uh-huh.
Or the ability that many people have such buying power. And of course they're going to be even better, but let's just face reality.
So the Democrats, so let me, absolutely. It's a huge issue. Inequality, we've never had deeper levels of inequality in the history of the country.
It's injustice.
Well,
It's injustice.
so if I could answer,
If you allow me, just to finish what I wanted to say. Basically, it's injustice, sir. It's not hate. The hate comes, sir, from the fact that, yes, sir, you mentioned something that a lot of people have mentioned, the scholarships that go to kids. Well, of course, the people that know people are going to get those scholarships, sir. And normally, the people that know people are people in a higher rank. Now, if that is, I don't feel hate. I don't feel hate, but it hurts me to see this country. I was raised in the third world country,
mhm.
and the inequality between the classes doesn't allow the people at the bottom to be free.
Mhm.
And it hurts me.
I suspect that we're,
It hurts me to see it happen because
I suspect that you and I are closer together on this issue than you guess.
I'm just explaining.
I understand, and I think I agree, but you need to let me talk at a certain point. So the point being that, yeah, inequality is an extraordinarily important issue in the United States. There's an index called the Gini Index that Americans and actually across the world, they've been keeping since the 1940s. And what the Gini Index demonstrates is that the level of inequality in the United States is greater now than ever, okay? And what that, of course, suggests is that people who are at the bottom of the economic ladder have fewer opportunities to move up the economic ladder. In fact, it's been described by a lot of economists as very much like what Europe used to be like during the era where classes determined what people's outcomes were going to be like. To move out of the lower classes in the United States is extraordinarily difficult, way more difficult than when my parents did it in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s. Yes, but what tends to level the playing field on average is government, actually. So government programs, progressive taxation, spending on people who are less fortunate. So think about a fight, all right? So let's say you have a really strong person and a really weak person that's in a fight. Let's say I am going to go toe-to-toe, mano a mano with Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson beats me every time, all right? I know you guys think, you look pretty tough, Hetherington, but Mike Tyson beats me every time. He knocks me out. What is the only thing that could level the playing field between me and Mike Tyson? Somebody coming in on my side. The crowd, people who are like me who would benefit from things. So which groups don't want government to do much? Conservative groups, groups who have things, the haves, they don't want government programs because they have, on average. What are the groups that tend to want government to do more? The have-nots. So in a system where there's so much hate across the party divide, nothing gets done. We have these last three Congresses are the very least productive in the history of Congress. Left and right won't work with each other. Government doesn't work. And that's the big reason why we have the level of income inequality that we have these days. Yes, sir. No, it's okay. No, it's fine. No, it's fine. But you know what's really interesting about all this? It's passionate. I mean, politics these days is so passionate. I had this terrible / incredible experience yesterday, actually 2 days ago, in this very room for a woman who was sitting right there. And she, these students, they're so worried about where do we go from, after this election, especially the students of color. And this young woman from rural Louisiana said, what do I do, in my Facebook feed? All of these people are calling me names, and they're calling me racial epithets, and it doesn't feel like they're my friends. I mean, the passions are spilling out, and this is why we have to find a way to connect with each other and frankly, love each other a little bit more. I think that's really key. So I am not concerned at all about your question or your experience with things, but what I am really interested in is getting to the point where we can actually hear each other rather than making a decision about, I'm not going to agree with that person because that person wears a red shirt or a blue shirt. That's where we have to get. Anyway, yes, sir.
Yeah, I watch quite a bit of MSNBC,
Uh-huh.
CNN, especially during the year and a half of this,
Election.
just the election is coming up, and with all these panel shows, with all these experts, I guess most of them, not all of them, but I never once heard any of them talk about, look out, look what happened in Britain,
Yeah.
Brexit, and look out what's happened in several of these European nations with the right-wingers maybe not winning, but increasing their percentages, and I just didn't hear that.
Mhm. All right, so this is a great question. I actually found myself in London about a month before the presidential election, so a few months after Brexit. They asked me to come to talk on this subject. The concern about a Trump victory was palpable in Europe. Now, of course, this was like the elites of Europe. This was the internationalist economic elite in this regard. And Brexit's a disaster for them. And my response was, don't worry about it. Not going to happen. It's different here. So if you're asking me to tell you how this happened, you may be asking the wrong guy. I mean, I'm gobsmacked, stunned by this. Now, one thing that is interesting, the polls actually didn't turn out to be that wrong. As it turns out nationally, they were showing a 3 to 4 point Hillary victory. It looks like she's going to win by 1.5 to 2 in terms of the national popular vote. And the state-by-state polls were showing at the end this movement in the industrial Northeast states towards her. So there was late movement. My best sense is that, so think about Trump supporters. What are they as it relates to the media in particular? They're hostile. They hate him. So I think that a lot of Trump supporters opted out of the surveys. I think they just didn't take them. So you think about your telephone. It says Gallup organization's calling. So when we looked at, say, working class whites, we underestimated the percentage of working class whites who were going to vote for him in that regard. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of us, maybe not a lot, some of us are old enough to remember newsreels from Europe, I think.
Yeah.
And I call to your attention a book called Extraordinary Popularity,
Mm-hmm.
Madness of Crowds.
Okay.
And that's an element I think
Mm-hmm.
is prevalent.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of people, so the question basically is about, whether there are parallels to be struck between, here, now, and it's not just here. So Brexit happened. Marine Le Pen in France, the National Front leader, is poised to do very well in a national election. This sort of wave of right-wing populism is taking place, what's called right-wing populism, all across the developed world. And what I think characterizes it, and you guys correct me if you think I'm wrong, but it's a rejection of internationalism, and this focus on, what's good for the world as opposed to what's good for us. And there are these internationalist elites, who get together in Brussels, Belgium, and they gaze at their navels and tell us what the world's going to look like in the future, and we're sick of it. And it could have been Trump, it could have been somebody else, but someone with that message, somebody who's not part of the system. It had to be somebody who wasn't part of the system. So why did Jeb Bush not get any traction? Why did the person who looks most like me than any politician, John Kasich, see? Why didn't he get any traction? Because they're part of the system. But Donald Trump, even though he's incredibly rich in an economic elite, he's from outside the process. So he has a certain credibility to say, I'm going to upset the process. Whereas if Marco Rubio were saying, I'm gonna upset the process, they look, no, you're not. You're a senator. But Donald Trump is different. So I think, this notion of someone coming from outside, who's attacking this, this world order, kind of thing, I think that's a big part of it. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a totally different type of question. Have you heard of or studied the backfire effect when something is out there?
Yep. Okay, so so a couple things. So this seminar is supposed to end at 12:15. And if folks want to go, I know you've been sitting down for a while, feel free. It won't hurt my feelings. But if you would like to stick around, I'm happy to talk for longer. I'm happy to answer questions for longer, and stuff like that. So the notion of the backfire effect is, let's say there's something that's demonstrably false, like something along the lines of vaccines kill little kids, or they cause autism, or whatever. But let's say you really believe that autism is caused by vaccines. If somebody corrects you, you tend to believe what you already believed even more strongly. It backfires. So in other words, correcting people may well just cause them to feel even more strongly that what they think is true is true. So take climate change. Most scientists say climate change is happening. But if you correct somebody who believes that climate change is not happening, not only do you not cause them to agree with you, you cause them to believe what they already believed even more. And you can see, getting back to the media environment, where people can hear what they want to hear all the time. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be out there. And now what? I don't know, man. I'm worried. I'm really worried. So the great question, is that the mistrust of the source, or is it something different? So hands here, how many people really trust the media? Source, part of it. But the second part of it is also like our self-esteem. We have these identities that we try to protect. And sometimes we just do these things because they, in Texas, I went to graduate school at the University of Texas. They now have campus carry. You can carry a gun on campus as long as you're a senior, I think, or over the age of 21. Why? There was the tower shooting in 1966. But it's not because of that. It's because of their identity. It's a gun-carrying identity. That's why. And people are protecting that. And when they feel like that identity is under assault by people, a bunch of fuzzy-headed academics or, whatever that elite might be, then they get even more protective. So it's both, they don't believe the source, and it means something to them to continue to believe these things. I like the story too.
Right now, I think a lot of us are really in shock, and obviously statistics show that we are just radically divided from each other. What are your constructive suggestions for trying to bridge that gap?
Yeah.
I feel very strongly, I agree with your statistics, I feel very strongly about my position on this.
Yeah.
And I find it very awkward for me to try to go to talk to someone whom I think has an absolute opposite
Mhm.
view, and even not be really well to that. But diplomatic, but you're trying to bridge this gap. I want to hear some.
I got nothing. Okay, so the question is, what can we, sort of tangibly do to try to bridge this divide? So I'll tell you a story because the best I got's a story, and the story includes my favorite character, me, and it involves me moving to the suburbs of Tennessee instead of to the city. So I know that it's going to come as a shock to you, but my politics are left of center. And with that in mind, I moved into a deep red, suburb. And when we moved there, it was 2004. One of the first things that my wife did was put a Carrie Edwards sign in the front lawn. And I thought to myself, no one's ever going to talk to us. What are you doing? But we did get an anonymous note. in our mailbox. And the anonymous note said, "I'm glad to know that there's another Democrat on the street." It was not from a Republican, it was from a Democrat, but they remained anonymous, despite all of that. But, what I've had happen is living in that suburb, I've come into contact with a lot of people who disagree with me politically. In fact, I sit with them at Little League baseball games for hours on end, and we talk about politics and we talk about other stuff, and we don't necessarily agree about everything or even maybe sometimes much of anything, but we sit there and we talk. And I think that this is so telling because what these scores, these low scores tell me is that you have a picture, all of you have a picture in your head about what the other side is like. Not necessarily contact with that person, but it's a picture and it's a worst case picture. It's a caricature. Just like my neighbors, when Suzanne put the Carrie Edwards sign in our front lawn, before they got to know us, had a picture in their heads, oh my God, those people down the street. But then it turned out that they met us, and we're not awful. And in fact, we love our kids, and we go to church, and we do all of these different things that maybe they wouldn't have anticipated. So what we have to do is figure out ways to have contact. Maybe we'll disagree, and maybe we just have to put up with disagreements. Sometimes people at the baseball games will say things to me that make me want to scream, but I don't. And we just keep talking. And then, maybe through this contact. So you think about racial prejudice or prejudice against gays and lesbians. How do we overcome prejudice? It's contact. It's when people turn from being caricatures into real people. One more question. Yes, sir.
On your characteristics of the two party leanings, things like individualism and self-reliance seem to me a little at odds with leaning toward the Democratic Party, which is thought of as a party of big government, more regulation, that sort of thing. What's your explanation?
I think that if we asked those questions to Republicans and Democrats in the 1950s and 60s and 40s, we'd get a different pattern. Because that's what the Republican Party was more about, But what the Republican Party has evolved into, and my dad, I feel for my dad. My dad is an old-time, sort of free enterprise Republican, who is interested in low business taxes and allowing ideas to flower and things like that. He's not about building walls. Ronald Reagan said, if they care enough to get here, we'll take them. And that used to be, sort of the Republican approach to immigration and things along these lines. The party has evolved into something that's very much more about authority and hierarchy and followership, frankly. So, and it points up, politics has changed, in these demonstrable ways. The Republican Party is split. There are still people like my dad in the party, and the Democratic Party is split. Not everybody is fluid in their worldview either. But on average, these are the things that now matter. All right, so I've gotten the tea. They're calling time on me. But thank you so much. I'm always happy to talk. And if you have questions, please come up and see me afterwards, okay?